Everyone, my name is Nanji Mateo. I'm the founder of interpremet.com, and this is going to be a very quick video to briefly explain some common translation choices that make you sound less native in Spanish when doing English to Spanish translation. So, let's get started. Choice 1, using the infinitive instead of the imperative mood. I have noticed that a lot of English speakers tend to leave a lot of the verbs unconjugated in the infinitive mood instead of using other moods like the imperative or the subjunctive. This makes it easier sometimes to use verbs, but it also makes you sound less natural. For example, if you say, bring comfortable clothes, it's an instruction and you translate it as traer ropa cómoda. Well, I can understand what you're saying, but it doesn't sound quite natural to my ear. Instead, I think when you use the imperative mood, it sounds much more natural. Traiga ropa cómoda. And it implies that it is that person that needs to bring comfortable clothes. So, if you want to sound more natural, conjugate your verbs correctly. All of them. We have so many tenses in Spanish, and we really do use a wide variety of them, especially the subjunctive mood. Choice number 2, starting a sentence without an article. This is interesting because it reminds me of my primary school days where I will do handwriting and write down sentences. They always started with an article at the beginning. So, for example, here we have penicillin is used to treat infections. Okay, if you translate it as penicilina es usada para tratar infecciones, it sounds a bit off. It sounds a bit strange, even though I can perfectly understand you. And this is the thing when I say it sounds off, it sounds strange, is that it's just the way people tend to use the language, and sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense from our point of view of our other language, but we have to keep our minds open and think about this is just a different system when things work, a different planet, if you will, where things work differently. So the most natural way to render this will be la penicilina, putting that article at the beginning. La penicilina se usa para tratar infecciones. So, here is another interesting thing happening in this sentence. You will notice that in English it is in the passive voice, penicillin is used. But in Spanish, I use la penicilina se usa. And this is important because whenever you can, you should try to switch the passive voice in English into the active voice in Spanish. This will make your sentences sound so much natural and easier to read. So, whenever possible and reasonable, you should do it. It's not like we don't use the passive voice. It's not like you cannot understand someone. It's just that it sounds incredibly off to a native speaker's ears. So keep that in mind. Choice number 3, using tú too much and not using usted or using too many pronouns. This is a lot here, so let's unpack this, right? So here we have this sentence. She'll give you your medication tomorrow. Here we have, ella te va a dar el medicamento mañana a ti. We have a couple of issues in these sentences. Let me mention the first one. It is that you are using the informal tú. Now, the informal tú, we use it when we talk to people we are really familiar with in the oral language, when we are talking to children or close friends, etc. But when we are in a medical center, in a patient-doctor relationship, or in a written document, we will use usted. unless the person allows you to call them by tú. When we are speaking to older people, we will also use usted when we're talking to the elderly or senior adults. Now, if sometimes you do use tú in written documents, when it's done for marketing purposes or intentionally to convey a certain sense of being personal, being approachable and intimate. So that's very intentional in those kinds of documents as well. But let's say you are in a doctor-patient encounter and you hear this statement. You will actually want to use usted and the conjugation that matches usted. In this case, it will be ella le va a dar. Le va a dar, is equivalent to usted. And we also notice something else towards the end of this sentence. Mañana ella te va a dar el medicamento mañana a ti. That last bit, a ti, is a bit redundant because when you say ella te va, it's already implied that it is you. So we can drop the a ti at the end and it will be less redundant. Another way you can also say is le va a dar el medicamento mañana, if it's very clear that we know who we are talking about. This is interesting because in English, English is very, very possessive. Think about things like the body parts, right? You say, my arm hurts, but in Spanish you will say, el brazo, excuse me, el brazo me duele, or la mano me duele, the hand hurts, the arm hurts. But in English, you use a lot of I, me, my. But in Spanish, you really do not specify the subject so much or the pronouns, more like the who is doing what in the sentence, the subject of the sentence. So if you want to sound more natural, you can try to omit the subjects of the sentences more often. Instead of saying yo como manzanas, I eat apples, you can simply say como manzanas. And sometimes you do use yo to emphasize that it is you. It's very common on legal documents to say yo doy mi consentimiento. In those cases, then it is okay. But in everyday language, we can drop the subjects and it will be fine. Choice number 4, not using reflexive pronouns. Reflexive pronouns are the ones like me, le, lo, la. For example, if you hear, can you hand her the phone? And you say, ¿podría pasar el teléfono a ella? That's okay. We can understand. But if you say, ¿podría pasarle el teléfono? O podría pasarle el teléfono a ella? That sounds a bit natural. Sometimes these reflexive pronouns simply roll out of your tongue if you are a native speaker. They come out so easily. And when you don't use them in all the times, at all times, but if you drop one or two reflexive pronouns here and there, it gives your speech so much color, so much vibrance, and it makes you sound a lot more natural. Choice number 5, droga y drug. This is more about terminology, more than grammar or style. Here we have an example. Prescription drugs. There is a difference between droga and fármaco and medicamento in Spanish. Droga almost always refers to illegal drugs, things like marijuana, cocaine, and things like that. There is a lot of negative connotations associated to the word drug. But medicamento is more like a healing drug, something that you take to get better, a medicine. Literally, that's what it means. But fármacos is more neutral. It has to do more with the nature of drugs, in my view, meaning that a fármaco is just some chemical that does something in the body, right? So that's a fármaco, and that's the neutral way of saying drugs. So never ever confuse droga and drug because it can certainly cause a lot of misunderstanding. Drug is medicamento, medicina, fármaco when it's about medication for blood pressures and things like that. But when we're talking about illegal drugs, then only then we use the word droga in Spanish. And those were the 5 choices that you could make to sound either more natural or less natural or native in Spanish. Remember to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and you can also contact me at nanjimatel.com. Thank you very much, and until the next time.